Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea, and welcome to everyone. Those who have been with us a few times maybe before, and of course also to the new participants in the webinar today. As you can see, some of you will know that I usually stream from home, but today I'm at the university here in Wellington, Victoria University of Wellington, and so we have put a lot of effort into making sure that all our technology is working and Wi-Fi is working, but if there are any connectivity issues throughout the webinar, my apologies in advance, but I'm very confident it will all go very well. We have done these webinars since lockdown, actually, since April this year, and this is our 13th webinar now, I think. And they are part of a series called Progressive Thinking, and we have published a couple of, or a few books, booklets, I should say, as part of those series. And one of them was on tax, one on housing, one on the future of work, and this one is on the future of public and community services. And the booklet, we haven't published it yet, but it will be published later this year, so watch this space. They are all available on our Facebook, on our website, and you can find the old booklets there, and also the recordings from previous webinars and the chapters that people contributed to the webinars. So just a quick run through on how we do the webinars here. So we'll have just a quick introduction with our guest today. And then our guest will have around about 10 minutes to share his ideas and thoughts with you. And after that, or during the presentation, of course, as well, you're most welcome to use the question and answer function down there at the bottom of your screen to post your questions. And as all our guests, Mike has also agreed to answer any remaining questions afterwards if we can't bring them into the conversation. Sometimes there are quite a lot of questions and we don't have the time for all of them, so you will get them answered after the webinar. Also, please keep your questions nice and short and succinct. That will be very helpful for me to bring them into the conversation. And yeah, I think that's probably all. Of course, needless to say, if you really enjoy this, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And you also find recordings later in the week on Facebook and, as I mentioned, the website. So let's get started, I'd say. Very warm welcome to you, Mike Joy, Senior Research Fellow at the School of Government here at Victoria University of Wellington. And as always, Mike and I have talked before the webinar, and I asked him for his 3 words that describe his work, the motivation for his work, or parts of himself. So, and Mike actually told me that his 3 words are reality, energy, and ecology. Mike, can you enlighten us why you chose those words, and can you explain it a little bit to us?
Yeah, sure. I guess that I'll go backwards with it. With ecology, it's that's what I am. That's what I've studied and spent the last couple of decades working on. And as an ecologist, I think that we're quite different from most other scientists in that we see all of the interconnections. Ecology.
I'm sure you will.
Is all about the interconnections and Indigenous understanding, and so where Western science and Indigenous knowledge thought to be separate, I think the one place where they're not separate, in fact, they're completely on the same page as ecologists, and that. So that is really a big part of the way I see the world, and that understanding has led to me getting very interested in this idea of energy, and so not just the way we think of it, I guess, in
You're breaking up a
you know,
little,
turning
Mike.
on the switch or you know, the thing that drives. Oh, sorry. I don't know. I can do much about it. The only other thing I could do possibly is switch to the phone and do it Zoom on the phone. Is that still breaking up?
No, you're good again. It's just
Okay.
sometimes in between. Let's continue and try this for the moment.
Okay. So the coming back to the energy and ecology link, it's about understanding the idea of the energy return on energy investment, which is so key to nature and understanding biological systems, is that the way that animals exist and humans, that we have to have a better return of energy for what we invest into doing anything. Whether you imagine a tiger chasing, you know, an animal around the Serengeti, there has to be more return for the effort that goes in to be able to survive. And I see that that humankind is in this position now where the fossil fuel energy that drives everything that we have around us and drives the huge population that we now have is coming to an end, with a combination of the fact that we have to stop using it, but also the fact that the energy return on the energy we invest into getting the energy is declining. So we have the situation where you need to and this is hard to explain, but I hope that people get it, is that we need to spend more and more energy to get the same amount of energy. So what that means is that we have to have more energy. So we have to keep burning more and more fossil fuels to get the same amount of fossil fuels. And there's quite a steep downward, a thing called a Seneca cliff that we're involved in, where if we, and the reason it interests me so much is that I fear this kind of naive belief that we can carry on living like we're living at the moment and somehow just switch over to this renewable energy. And there's not the understanding of and that's where the other word I had, the reality of the fact that we don't have the energy, and we won't be able to live the same energy intensive lifestyles we have at the moment in the future. It's not a choice, it's the reality of the declining return on energy invested, and the fact that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And so that's kind of really shaping the way that I'm thinking now, and it kind of relates to the things that I'll be talking about around freshwater as well, because we have this huge issue in our fresh waters with nitrate, as an example, from intensification of farming and land use, that is
You have broken up again.
totally unnecessary.
Right.
Causes huge harm to okay. Or how's that? Is it?
Yeah. No,
Somebody suggested I turn my video off on it.
Well, we can try that.
Yeah.
Do you want to give it a go?
I'll give it a go and see if that makes a difference. It sometimes uses up less bandwidth if I do that. So, okay, is that sounding okay at the moment?
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, and it's better without being able to see me, I'm sure.
So what a loss.
So that's kind of where I'm at. Is so that idea that nitrogen and it's, you know, like releasing carbon into the atmosphere is harming us from industrial processes. But if we can't, the easy fix is nitrogen, because we should be able to do that. And if we can't fix nitrogen, then we're not going to be able to fix carbon. So I see that as a microcosm of our bigger problems, and it's certainly the thing that we should that's the example from my work of the work that I've been trying to do to highlight the issues around fresh water in New Zealand, and then get some response from the government to reduce those impacts.
Yeah, I think you're actually launching straight into your chapter in some areas there. So maybe we we just move into that part where you describing a little bit of your analysis, especially in terms of the importance of the future of environmental regulation. So yeah, I think you will have around about 10 minutes to share your thoughts, and then we'll have some
Sure.
questions
Yeah.
afterwards. Great, thank you.
Yep, no, that's cool. Okay, so I mean, what I was trying to get across in this environmental regulation type thought piece was just how, and I wonder how many people can really think about this, but you know, people think in terms of, oh, we have to, you know, have a worry about the planet, we'll destroy the planet. And of course, it's not the planet we're worried about, it's the life supporting capacity of the planet, and the life that we want it to support is our life, I guess. It's quite selfish in that way, but this idea of life supporting capacity, and to protect ourselves, to save us from ourselves, we need to have regulation, and we need to have regulation that's infinite. And it's really, really clear that we have failed, totally failed in that area. And it, of course, there's nothing else more important than that. But I can give you some examples from analysis that's been done on our environmental management, or our the state of the environment in New Zealand, and how we look after it. Pointed out, they compared 179 countries, and we came in at 18th. And that's not 18th from the top, that was 18th from the bottom. We are in not the top 25% or 50% or even the top 75% of countries in the world. We're in the bottom 25% when it comes to environmental performance. And that's based on water quality, fertilizer use, greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So it's been a total failure of regulation for the environment in New Zealand. And somehow there's a perception held overseas and among New Zealanders that we are clean and green, and it couldn't actually be further from the truth. I guess one of the best ways that I think of to understand that is to think of this idea of boundaries, so ecological boundaries. There's been quite a bit of work done, a lot of it coming from an institute in Stockholm, but looking at planetary boundaries. And if you look at that, then you can see that the boundaries, that is the limits that we need to stay inside to have a livable planet in the future. That's what we've gone out, and so you can kind of add these things up and see where we sit. But in this little country means that we use way more than our fair share of. And I guess that when I look at where the failures are, it's that we have legislation like that, and they're well written into the legislation, but the failure happens because of a failure to, also there's the huge number of people who are well paid and well resourced to keep on trying to find ways around this. And so, you know, you're kind of up against this constant battle, a bit like tax laws, I guess, where everybody's trying to find a way around it, and the ones that are trying to find their way around it are the best funded. And then you have organisations, whether they're central government or local government, that are fixated on this idea of economic growth and want to favour anybody that does anything that's likely to enhance economic growth. And so we can see that happening within central, and I mean, I guess that the best way to explain it many of the people listening to this will I'm sure be aware of this, is this idea of agency capture. So that's been seen in many places with the Resource Management Act. It's been well written up. My friend Marie Dull, who was working at Environmental Defence Society, wrote a great book that talked about this, about regional council failures because of agency capture, where people are working with organisations all the time that are involved in polluting the environment, or they're regulating other regional district councils that breach resource consents and that kind of thing. And you just have this endless cycle of failure that comes about, not because the legislation's necessarily bad, but because there's all of these reasons why it doesn't get enforced. And it's a lack of resourcing, it's a lack of understanding in some cases. And it's things like the examples that I've been involved in many times over freshwater, where you have, for example, and I've written about this in my little chapter, a district council that has a consent to discharge wastewater into a river, and it's never once complied with the resource consents, and the punishment or the penalty that the regional council dishes out to that district council for those failures is a sad face stamp. So the report comes back, they send the information in, they've failed on these resource consent conditions, and the response from the regional council is to give them a sad face stamp. And it's funny in some ways, I guess, but it has shocking outcomes because, of course, nothing changes. It's much easier for that council to ignore those requirements and just carry on doing what they're doing. Much cheaper to do that, to keep on polluting that river, because the only penalty is a sad face stamp, and it's politically expedient to just carry on doing that. You can keep rates low and that kind of thing. So and I think this has come out really recently with Judge Randerson's report on the Resource Management Act, where it's just that it's a failure, a complete failure of the enforcement and application of the Act rather than the Act itself. So I think that's one of the really big issues that we're going to have to deal with, is making sure that we change that, the reasons behind it, make sure that it has to be enforced. I think there's a number of ways that we could do that. I suggest that one of the best ways would be, it's clearly the problem is politicization. So in the case of the regional council not fining that district council because it would be fining its own ratepayers, you know, there's no incentive to do anything about that. So we need to take that, and I've also got many examples of environmental monitoring and reporting that's influenced by the politicization of that organization, where they go to great lengths to make things sound better than what they actually are. So I would love to see, and I think the future for managing the environment would have to be taking that political aspect out of it, using something like the model of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. There's talk about a Waterways Commission. Some way of taking that role of collecting, not necessarily collecting the data, but certainly reporting on the data and making sure that the resource consents and that environmental regulation is carried out properly, has to be done by some kind of independent body. And, you know, something along the lines of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. I'm sure that there are other potentially better ways of doing that, but that's the model that I see at the moment, somehow depoliticizing the process and putting the science back into it. I mean, it's particularly frustrating for me to see the government's response to COVID, where they trust the science and apply it, and we're all better off for it. But somehow the epidemiologist gets trusted, and the freshwater scientists, as an example, and the environmental scientists don't get that same level of trust and are not taken as seriously. Maybe because the impacts are further off. You know, they're not immediate like they are with COVID. Maybe that's why they you know, don't react as quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. And I already have like 1 million questions
Mhm.
myself. We also have questions from the audience. So maybe since you mentioned the example of local councils,
Mm.
I'm quite interested in the idea of having a commissioner or an independent agency to better monitor enforcement of regulation. Is there anything, or have you thought about how people who work in the public sector or local government can be better empowered to actually enforce the existing regulations? And that is an internal question. But then there's also an external one about bringing communities and iwi into the reviewing or the process of granting consent, for instance. That could be an idea as well. They know the place, that would give them a strong collective voice, agency as well. And that could be another idea that would work together with, a commissioner or an independent agency. What do you think about those ideas? And how would we make that work if you thought it would be useful?
Yeah, I've kind of, I mean, it's written all through the RMA about Maori participation, and we have the example of an act of parliament for co-management of the Waikato River, and I was very, very hopeful in 22 when that legislation was passed. I thought finally we would get somewhere with freshwater in New Zealand when we had a co-management, the Waikato Tainui. I can't remember the exact words of it, but there's an act. And then just to have those hopes completely dashed when even with that co-management, they've come up with a plan to fix up the Waikato River. But they've set a date 80 years, 80 years into the future. And so, I mean, that was just a huge disappointment for me to see how that something I'd been so hopeful about is coming through. I noticed in the latest national policy statement for freshwater, which I've been involved in as an advisor on a science technical advisory group, that there is a must in there that regional councils must involve Māori in participation in the process, exactly how you described it. But it seems, from my experience, that's a box ticking exercise. The other problem is that there seems to be no process where those councils can be held to account. I mean, I've got many examples of their failures where I've written it up and complained to the Ministry for the Environment, but there is no higher authority to those councils. They pretty much do as they wish. And so my hope my hope in the past that kind of process would make a difference has been dashed. So I'm not holding out much hope for the future national policy statement.
And what do you think about empowering people who are working with councils, for instance, to do, a more effective job, I guess, when it comes to enforcing regulation? Do you have any advice, any guidance on what people could be doing?
I think the problem is, I mean, the way I see it, and I've got many colleagues and friends and ex-students who work in the councils, and I know that they're great people and with the best intentions and very, very smart people, but it's that process somehow, and this will probably make me really unpopular with the audience, but I see these councils and the ministries as well as the outcome is less than the sum of the parts. I mean, it's really, you normally hear that in reverse, that something's more than the sum of its parts. But I see my frustration with, working with these groups is that the parts are really good, but somehow the organization, and I'm sure it's the political aspect of it, means that the result that comes out of it. So if the council doesn't resource the enforcement, and you only have a couple of enforcement officers or compliance officers unfunded, and they know that they're going to go into a process that's going to lead into court, because the polluter has all the money in the world up against your very limited budget within the council. And I understand the limitations on how you can enforce that. So it's at the highest level within these organisations that the changes need to be made. I don't think there's a problem with the belief and the knowledge of the people who are working in the coalface. It's the bigger decisions that are made that don't resource them, and I'm sure they're just as frustrated with the process as I am.
We have quite a few questions about the Three Waters reform or program, and people are quite interested to hear your thoughts on the program and also your latest research in terms of fresh water. So maybe just share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and maybe
some of the risks and opportunities with that program, actually.
Yeah, like I mean, I like the idea. I think it's come from the Havelock North disaster that it was sort of prompted this need to do something about the Three Waters. The problem that I see, and this will relate to what I want to talk about next, about what's happening with fresh water, is there's very little emphasis on protecting the source of the water. The Three Waters project is about how to treat the water, whether it's stormwater or drinking water. And so it's about trying to fix. It's an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff kind of approach, whereas I'm all for trying to put a fence at the top of the cliff and not need those ambulances. And there are so many examples of how you protect a catchment and then you have the best water and you don't have to do anything about it. I think so. Canterbury's a really good example for people to understand. I've been doing some work with Michael Baker from Otago School of Medicine and others on the link between nitrate in drinking water and colorectal cancer. So we have colorectal cancer, I'm sure most are aware of, is the second biggest killer as far as cancers go globally. New Zealand has the highest rates of colorectal cancer of any developed country in the world. And within New Zealand, the highest rates are in the intensively farmed parts of New Zealand that have light soils, where the nitrate from intensive farming gets quickly into the drinking water. And then the limits, the numbers that we have around limits for nitrate. So we've gone in a half a century, especially in the last couple of decades, from virtually no nitrate in the drinking water to levels now where a high number of people in New Zealand have increased risk of getting colorectal cancer as a result of nitrate in the drinking water. So that the thing that frustrates me, and I touched on it before, is that nitrate is unnecessary. We didn't add artificial nitrate to our farming systems until the 80s. When we had all this, this kind of industrial process where we make it from fossil fuels. So it's like a double whammy. I can't imagine that you can think of something more unsustainable than turning fossil fuels into food or milk, as we do in this case, or milk powder. And so we artificially add this. It's not necessary. In the same way, it's a money earner. It's something that farmers get addicted to, the same as kids get addicted to sugar. And there's an industry in producing this stuff, and they have such a big sway here. So so back to the Three Waters. What we instead of, and interestingly with nitrate, you virtually can't get rid of it. But their kind of approach is let's treat the water, let's chlorinate it, let's do something at the end of it to try and make sure it's safe for humans. Whereas I want us to go back a step and not pollute the water in the first place, and then we won't need to treat it. And so we could, and it's just a crazy situation where completely illogical land use change has happened, driven by irrigation to turn a dry land into a dairy farming area that's had massive impacts on drinking water for a huge number of people, particularly in the South Island. So it's a classic case study of an industrialization of a process that's resulted in the potential for a lot of harm.
I'm just thinking about other countries. Are there any examples actually where the prevention of water pollution was successful, or can't you think of any? Do they all take
No,
a similar approach?
no,
In the sense that they step in when it's too late.
yeah, no, there is a classic example from New York City. That's the one that's quoted often, but I'm sure there's many more examples where they got to the situation where the city had grown so big and they were spending huge amounts of money on treating the water, that they went to one of the big catchments and they removed animals from the catchment. They took away all of the animal farming from up there. And I've read about it at the time. Everybody was panicking. Land values were going to crash, and how can you tell? Stop farmers from farming animals and all that kind of thing. But what actually happened was that taking the animals away and growing of trees and fruit and all kinds of other land uses that happened there were really positive for the big catchment area, for the valley, and for the people of New York. I mean, it was a one-off cost to do that, and then from then on they have safe, clean water. You don't have to keep treating it. And I can give you similar examples in New Zealand, not so much from a drinking water point of view, but we do actually pay farmers not to farm cows or dairy farm intensively or have animal intensive farming in two catchments in New Zealand, one for Lake Taupo and one for Lake Rotorua, where we're actually paying millions of dollars and have paid in the example of Lake Taupo, but are currently paying $40 million as taxpayers to have a bunch of farmers not farm animals in those catchments. The scientists have come up with an amount of nitrogen that the lake can absorb and come up with a limit of 100 tons. They want to reduce the nitrate into Lake Rotorua by 100 tons a year. So they're paying $40 million to these farmers to not have cows to protect that lake. Now that's a good approach. It's an extremely expensive approach. And if we applied, so it works out to $400 per kilogram of nitrate that's leached from those farms. If we took that same approach in Canterbury, then we would be looking at $12 billion to pay the farmers of Canterbury not to farm those cows to protect those waterways, if we applied the same logic that we apply to Lake Rotorua and Lake Taupo. So that will give you an idea of the kind of economic balance that we're thinking about here, and that $12 billion is pretty close to what dairy is worth nationally to us per year. If we were to pay just one region not to do it to protect those waterways, that's what we'd be talking about, $12 billion. And I think it's crucial for people to understand that if you effectively, you're subsidizing those farmers to do that, the same way that you're paying the farmers in those two lakes not to farm to protect those lakes. We're not doing anything about it in Canterbury. Thereby, we are subsidizing that land use to the tune of $12 billion a year. Or, you can do the sums wherever you want to go in New Zealand, by not having a cost on the harm that's done to the environment and actually to future generations, because many people in the South Island are going to have to find alternative water supplies for drinking water. So we're effectively subsidizing that intensive land use, and that's something that we've got to kind of wake up and grow up as a nation and question why do we do that? Why do we allow one industry to do so much harm and basically subsidize a very, very harmful process like that?
I think what it really shows is that environmental challenges that we all face are very deeply embedded into that wider economic and social system, and the relationships, drivers, and motivations that come with it, also of individuals, of course. We have one question about, how willing are people to really, make change happen in the environmental space. And I'm wondering, because of that embeddedness, how do we bring, those competing interests and competing motivations and and interest for outcomes, how do we bring them together, especially as you mentioned with farming, the economic interests, you know, the economic interests of particular regions as well. Is there a way to find a compromise in that bigger kind of scheme of things, if you like?
Yeah, I think that well, one of the solutions would be to do something about our economic system. I mean, it's a pretty clearly a faulty economic system that where you can have an industry that does so much harm somehow show up as a positive. So we just ignore the externalities of that and many other industries. So if we could, I mean, there is change happening with this, you know, this talk of well-being and Treasury actually including well-being in how they measure. And I'm sure that you know, some of your other speakers like Jonathan Boston and Jeff Bertram have talked about, you know, from an economic point of view, how if we included well-being, somehow if we could include the externalities of a whole bunch of things that we do in our analysis, where we don't just blindly, you know, ignore the harm and only look at the profit side of things. If we were to change the economic system so that it took into account the externalities, then we would quickly realize if there was a balance sheet that had to be shown from these industries, where they had to show what harm they do to the environment or to our future, alongside what money they bring in, then we would very soon change how we view them and how we value them.
Mm-hmm. And this would be actually a good question to ask at the very end, but I need to ask it now, because I think it's really one of the crucial underlying questions to the environmental issues that we see. And the question is, why do governments not respond in the way they should? And it's not just New Zealand. This is a broader issue. This is an issue, a global issue, actually. So you already touched on the political interests, but what else is there that stops them to see it as an emergency and act with urgency to solve the problem long term?
Yeah, it's well, I think that, yeah, it's kind of the we have to rethink you know, the way that we measure everything and the way that we do it. Sorry, I got distracted a little bit there and lost it for a second. That, can you just repeat it, just the basis of the question?
Absolutely. It's a very big question. So it's very simple question, but complex to answer, I guess. But the question is, why do governments not respond in the way they should be responding, or they need to respond right now with urgency?
Yeah, I think there's that incredible amount of pressure from industry, and I'll give the example of the freshwater. And I guess that for decades, what I said was, and I would say this to my students or to anyone that would listen to me, that governments won't do anything on their own. They need to have a mandate to do it. They need to have the people telling them that that's what they want to happen. And I was totally a believer in that, and I've kind of had that hope dashed recently. But to give the example of freshwater, where a couple of decades of work from myself and a bunch of other people highlighting the issues around freshwater that resulted in, you know, a couple of polls leading up to the last election, and even more recently with New Zealanders saying that, more than 80% of New Zealanders saying that freshwater is the #1, you know, environmental issue for New Zealanders. So, and then we had the process for the national policy statement changes, where you had working groups set up by government. We had a Kahui Wai Māori group, a freshwater leaders group, a science technical advisory group that I was on. So basically we handed the government the best mandate they could ever hope for around freshwater. They had the science telling them what they needed to do. They had the polls telling them that it was the most important thing for New Zealanders. They even had a heap of evidence that it wasn't that they won the election based on that, but that National lost the election last time based on their failure to protect freshwater. So they had everything handed to them on a plate, and yet they still managed to not do what they needed to do around setting those limits. So the changes to the national policy statement, they look great on paper, but they lack the crucial numbers to make it applicable, which is part of that, going back to that very first question about why do councils not achieve what they need to around freshwater and not the enforcement. It's because they don't have the numbers there. They're given too much discretion, and if you give discretion, then it's open to be pulled apart by the polluters, and it makes it much harder for the councils to achieve anything. If you have, it's a bit like having discretion around, if we had for, speeding limits on our roads, if we just had a discretion rather than set numbers, then we would have mayhem on the road. So discretion for the police or discretion for the drivers, then it wouldn't work. And that's what we have at the moment. So just, that's the failure of government, and I kind of really am losing faith in the democratic system, just to see that whole process unfold and be part of it, and to see that even when the government's given a complete mandate like that, they fail to achieve. I
would love to end on a positive note, actually. So
we'll see what we can do.
To encourage people's faith in that we together, that we can change something. And we had one of our guests recently who said, when I asked her about how people can, in their respective work environments or communities, affect change, and he said it's very important to be intentional about what you do and keep on doing it. So would you support that? And what would you add, actually, if you had something to add to that?
Yes, well, I think that what I'm seeing is that the real change doesn't come from government. It comes from the ground up. We're seeing that happening at the moment with the switch towards regenerative farming. I mean, we need to make everything we do regenerative, but we're seeing it with regenerative farming, where there's been absolutely no support from government at all. In fact, you get the government completely supporting the really harmful industrial farming processes with subsidies to all through the process to industrial intensive mechanistic farming. So I think that's a really good positive example, and maybe it's something that we need to think about, how we could do things differently, that it's going to come from us, from the community, from the ground up, not from central government down. They'll always be the last ones in the room. I'm sure that eventually, when regenerative farming really builds up in New Zealand, the government will be making out that it was up to them, that they were behind it. Afterwards, they'll say it's a good idea, but in the meantime, they're actually not helping at all. So I think that's the example. Communities working together. I mean, I can think of so many examples of community groups, unfunded, kind of unsupported. I mean, everyone knows them, from community gardens to housing trusts to all kinds of things that are happening in the community that are pretty much, the government doesn't do it, so we do it ourselves, and we're going to have to lead the way ourselves that way, and hopefully government will tag along afterwards.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We had a participant actually asking about the importance of regenerative agriculture as well, and you will be pleased to hear that MPI is actually starting to look into that. So hopefully they will make good progress on that. Thank you, everyone, for all the amazing questions. They were very specific, so I thank you very much for that. And I think it's much better for Mike to answer the remaining ones on paper, and you will get answers very shortly to them. So thank you very much. A lot of people on the call today. Sorry for the slight glitches with our Wi-Fi, but I hope you still enjoyed the conversation. You were very engaged, many questions, and I thank you for that very much. I would just like to announce our next webinar, which will be next Wednesday on the 2nd of September. And we are going to talk about the future of our health services. And we will be talking with Jackie Cummings and Leslie Middleton. So that should be another interesting one, very topical as well in terms of the health and disability system review. The final report has been presented recently, so I'm sure they will have lots to say about that. So again, thank you everyone very much, and I will leave you with saying thank you again and stay well.